So the Frankfurt School is this collection of mostly German Jewish scholars who constellate around the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt in the 1920s. I'd say the short version of what their intellectual project is, and the intellectual project of the rich PhD student whose family finances it, Felix Weil, is to try to find a kind of new synthesis of, as I mentioned earlier, sort of Marxism, psychoanalysis, German idealism, but particularly to find sort of a new way of thinking in this moment when capitalism, fascism, and communism are, in between two world wars in Weimar Germany. And sorry, I promised myself I was going to do this in a short way, and I'm already getting long. But around the Institute, these various figures get recruited in Germany in the 1930s, including Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse is a name folks might have heard, and Erich Fromm. I just a minute ago mentioned Walter Benjamin, who I think, depending on what you studied, if you went to an elite college or like a liberal arts college in the past couple decades, there's a very good chance that you read one or two things by Walter Benjamin. He was never officially part of the Institute and sort of has his own history, which is very sad. And so there's this early phase in Weimar Germany, pretty much immediately after Hitler came to power in 1933. The principal figures around the Institute flee, first to England, then to the United States, set up in Columbia, and have this period in the US. Some of them return to Germany, some don't after the war. Adorno and Horkheimer do, 1953. And then the Institute has, returns to Frankfurt and has a life there. So I'm trying not to go too in the weeds, but I think we could talk about sort of the ideas. We could talk about this sort of history that crosses mid-20th century history in this very turbulent and complex way. And there's also, I'd like to emphasize this because the third set of things we could talk about is the reception of the Frankfurt School in the US, because in a way, the Frankfurt School is a creation of like American and transatlantic academia in a certain sense. Now, there are also all kinds of conspiracies and ideas about it. But interestingly, contra the sort of mainstream narrative about all that, the Frankfurt School has a very, just a relationship of conflict with the radical student left in Germany in the 60s. And Adorno dies sort of as the enemy of the radical students in the late 60s. And so that's something else to talk about, sort of like what how the reality relates to sort of the large cultural narrative in the US about the Frankfurt School. But that was sort of long-winded. I think if you're going to read just one book about the history of the Frankfurt School, I would read Martin Jay's The Dialectical Imagination from 1973. It's a very readable intellectual history that combines, who migrated where when with kind of analyses of these often quite dense works written in French and German and English. But yes, I've been answering this question for a long time, so I want to make a space for Anna to say something, but that's sort of the broad context.
I love Dr. Rose Ragtime. There's this amazing sentence in the book. It's about like early 20th century New York and all the immigrants and all the different strata in society, all the celebrities before they become celebrities show up in the book, and then you can feel very smart. It's a wonderful read. And there's just this one sentence where, I don't know, something happens in the street and there is a cab going down a New York street and Freud is sitting in it. And he looks outside and he like hates the place. And it's not added the irony of how important very soon this guy will be in this city but he's like, he doesn't like it. It's dirty, it's loud. So we don't know how the Frankfurt School actually would think about the world in which, so many of their predictions are coming true.
And they were very marginal. I mean, sorry, just because I'm sitting here in Cambridge, Ernst Bloch, for instance, who is another sort of tangential member, tangential now to the extent that he's taught and remembered, was working as a dishwasher in Cambridge because he couldn't get a position as a faculty member somewhere. So yeah, there are all these sort of cross paths. If a doctor wanted to write a ragtime about that.
That's crazy. I would like to go and kind of segue into more like a more detailed overview of the thought. But I know that Zohar here has a question. Zohar, do you want to jump in before we go to the next next part of the conversation from your Florida? I don't know where your background is hanging out. The weather seems nice.
My question is about melancholy. So Adorno is known to be the like proponent of the melancholy science. And I'm wondering if it's possible to be part of the Frankfurt School and not be melancholy, or like how sort of incidental is this mood to the thought versus it's the essential, it's the most rigorous way to be woke to modernity or whatever. Like there's no other response than melancholy. Just because I guess maybe this, there's a one way of reading these people. Maybe this is the teenage version. It's not fair that like pathologizes people who aren't melancholy as sort of just, capitalist dweebs or something. And then
you're not taking it seriously enough if you're not sad.
Exactly. And like, I bristle against that, both as like a pluralist and as somebody who just wants to like be a little bit more optimistic about the possibility of flourishing, or some small attempt at it, even if like, let's say we live in a broken society. So that's like part A of the question. And I think part B, which maybe relates to it, is the weird way in which these thinkers are kind of reactionary because they hate modernity so much. And like, technically they're of the left, but it's kind of feels like, at least today, most people who are anti-modern or think that something like has changed intensely with modernity are like monarchists or like LARPing as fascists or something.
Yeah, these are two really excellent questions. And I've never done one of these before, so I don't know about the format, but I mean, I'd be curious to hear more about your sort of thoughts in contact with it too. I think in response to the question of melancholy, I think it depends who we're talking about. I think if we're talking about Adorno, for instance, that there's a commitment to negativity that is like sort of an essential part of his thought and cannot be extracted from it. I think for Herbert Marcuse, for instance, I'd say something different. But that, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. That does not mean that we have to adopt wholesale, or at least is my view. And these are both, really rich and big questions, and many different people have different opinions about them. But it's my view that we can sort of take up and use some aspects of the thought and work without being that melancholy. I mean, frankly, a German Jew of his generation, if anyone in history has earned the right to be very pessimistic about things, I think it's understandable why he was. On the other hand, I think about a figure like Angela Davis, who did her doctoral work with Herbert Marcuse and Adorno. I don't know if folks have seen Adorno's letter of recommendation for Davis flying or sort of floating around Twitter. It's sort of like it surfaces every once in a while. But there are certainly thinkers who sort of do things with their work or think with them who are not necessarily deeply pessimistic. And I read the intellectual debate between Benjamin and Adorno in a sense as a disagreement about precisely this question, right? Because Walter Benjamin and his history of the artwork in the age of its mechanical reproducibility, this famous essay, which I don't know if you're reading it as a teenager, if you were reading them as a teenager, maybe you read, is much more optimistic about the possibilities of sort of anti-fascist technology. Adorno is much more critical. So that's sort of a long answer, but it may not be dissociable from the thought of some of them, but I think we can take elements of the thought. I would also say just about Adorno being such a grump, and I always feel like that's sort of the punchline of that bathing suit photo Anna mentioned, is like, how silly for him to be in a bathing suit. He's such a grump. Like he just sort of becomes this figure of grumpiness. But that's also a way he styled himself to a certain extent, particularly after returning to Europe. I feel like he developed this persona and narrative about his life, which, wasn't baseless. He certainly did love difficult classical music and all that, but was a bit of a shtick. I almost want to say, but I think it can be exaggerated sometimes. For instance, his allergic reaction to American social science, I think, is a story that becomes more exaggerated later. On this question of reaction, I think this is literally the book I haven't been writing for the past 2 years because archives are closed and I can't get to them, is about precisely this, what I call hating theory, or sort of the right's, I call it a phobic fascination with critical theory. I think to give like a short to medium set of thoughts on the question, I think you're absolutely right that part of what appeals to, say, Steve Bannon about, or Andrew Breitbart, part of this strange elective affinity has to do with the cultural pessimism of the Frankfurt School. I think that's one thing. I think also, historically speaking, as I mentioned, there is this real break between the student left and Adorno, and to a somewhat less dramatic extent, Horkheimer and Habermas, but this really dramatic break in 68 and 69. And to that extent, I think there is a way in which they become part of an old guard that then attracts students or young people who are defining themselves against a radical student left, and in the US, particularly like a third worldist and of color student left. And there's a lot more to say about that, but I think the answer to both questions was yes, actually. Now that I try to sum it up.
This idea that all works of philosophy were written because of a personal beef or a personal...
Yeah, definitely.
And then you're like, what? And you just like wake up and you never read philosophy the same way again. So I absolutely take the Catholic parents as a very legitimate kind of reason for going into a world of thought.
My partner, who is the real Marxologist, always jokes about how good Marx would have been at Twitter, just like the philosophy of poverty and the poverty of philosophy, which has been like dunking. It was great. Yeah, of course. And again, this is a very Frankfurt School insight. It's like we are all both historical, particular beings wrapped up in our beefs and capable of transcending the immediate and historical. So absolutely.
It's a beautiful, beautiful kind of coda for this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, everybody. This has been recorded, so you will be able to rewatch yourself. If there are any questions remaining, send them to us via Twitter or Anna@interintellect.com. I will forward it to Moira. Thank you so much. This has been an absolute joy. And I hope that maybe we will, when your new book comes out and we get back to doing a salon soon, we can revisit maybe some of these topics once again.
Yeah, if it's my book, you might be waiting a minute, but I'm always happy to talk about the Frankfurt School.
Love it.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Nice
guys.
to see you. Take care.
Thank you, Moira.
Bye-bye.